My peaceful wetland was destroyed by a power-hungry HOA president. What she didn't know was that federal agents were already watching her every move, and her reign was about to crumble. A jarring rumble tore me from my sleep, a sound so harsh it vibrated through my very teeth. What was happening? I yanked back the curtains, and my breath caught in my throat. Two colossal dump trucks, tailgates gaping, were backing onto my beloved wetland, and there she was, Karen, the HOA's self-proclaimed queen, surveying the scene like a general conquering new territory, hands on her hips, a smirk playing on her lips, dirt and concrete spilled out, mercilessly burying the cattails and marsh grass I'd spent years nurturing. Anger? No, not yet. Just a gut-wrenching disbelief so profound it made me laugh. A hollow, bitter sound that tightened my jaw. Who, in their wildest dreams, would dare desecrate a federally protected wetland just to make a neighborhood pond look less swampy? Karen apparently had no such qualm. Still in my pajamas, I stormed outside, waving my arms like a desperate traffic cop. The contractors paused, shovels frozen mid-air, but Karen didn't even blink. Her oversized sun hat cast a shadow over that infuriatingly smug smile, a smile that screamed she'd already perfected her excuse. "We're improving community aesthetics," she declared, as if quoting sacred scripture from the HOA bylaws. I yelled back, pointing out she was breaking federal law, committing an environmental crime, but she just chuckled, dismissively waving her hand. "Don't be dramatic, it's just mud." Just mud? That was her justification for bulldozing a delicate ecosystem, a haven for everything from tiny frogs to graceful herons. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a brazen power grab. She truly believed if she acted fast enough, the damage would be irreversible. I ordered the workers to stop immediately, but Karen, like a monarch dismissing a lowly servant, simply snapped her fingers. "Don't listen to him. The HOA authorized this." One of the drivers met my gaze, then hers, and muttered something about just following orders. That phrase, it nearly pushed me over the edge, but I forced myself to stay calm. Losing my temper would only fuel her chaos. Instead, I pulled out my phone and started recording. Karen's face twitched as the camera lens locked onto her. "You can't record me without permission," she hissed, stepping forward. "Funny?" I retorted, my voice surprisingly steady. "Neither can you bury an entire wetland without permission." That silenced her for a beat. Just a beat. Within 60 minutes, half my wetland resembled a war zone. My carefully constructed boardwalk, where my wife and I shared quiet coffee mornings, lay crushed beneath broken concrete slabs. The air, once sweet with marshy scents, reeked of diesel. Neighbors emerged, confused, whispering amongst themselves, wondering, is this even legal? Karen, of course, strutted about, proclaiming it progress, assuring everyone they'd thank her when the swamp no longer bred mosquitoes. I longed to scream, to educate them. Wetlands aren't just mosquito factories. They filter water, they prevent flooding, they host entire food chains. But I knew, the more she talked, the deeper her grave became. All I had to do was gather irrefutable proof and wait. That evening, as the trucks finally rumbled away, I stood amidst the wreckage, trying to comprehend the devastation. My wetland, my sanctuary, was mutilated. Yet beneath the frustration, a sharper emotion simmered. Opportunity. Karen had made a monumental mistake. She wasn't just meddling with HOA landscaping. She was tangling with the federal government. And unlike me, the EPA doesn't tolerate insults lightly. I made 3 pivotal calls that night. One to Fish and Wildlife, one to the State Environmental Office, and one to a lawyer I kept on speed dial specifically for HOA absurdities. Each person I spoke with reacted identically, stunned silence, then disbelief. But when I emailed them the video of Karen brazenly directing those trucks, their tone shifted from confusion to intense, serious interest. The very next morning, Karen was back, clipboard in hand, strutting around my property as if she owned it, gloating about how smooth everything looked. Her perfume, strong enough to fell an ox, likely masked the stench of disturbed swamp gas. "Aren't you glad we cleaned it up?" she purred, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. I raised an eyebrow. "You might want to save that speech for the EPA investigators," I said, a slight smile playing on my lips. "They'll be here soon." Her face, oh, it was a masterpiece of bewildered panic, but she quickly recovered, tossing her hair with a scoff. You wouldn't dare, they won't care. This is just a neighborhood project. I pocketed my phone, my smile widening. They'll care, Karen, to the tune of $500,000, maybe more. What she didn't know was that the EPA had already confirmed my wetland was on their jurisdictional map, protected under the Clean Water Act. She hadn't just vandalized my land. She'd triggered one of the largest fines an HOA could ever face, and if I played my cards right, she would be personally liable. That thought alone allowed me to sleep soundly for the first time all week, even as images of dump trucks continued to haunt my dreams. By day 3, the unmarked government SUVs arrived, the kind that makes suburban neighbors peek through their blinds. Karen tried to intercept them, all smiles and outstretched hands, but they bypassed her entirely, striding straight toward me. I led them to the wetland, or what remained of it, and watched their expressions harden as they surveyed the damage. One investigator crouched, scooped up a handful of displaced soil, and murmured, "Clear violation." Karen, of course, chimed in, like a broken record. "It's just mud." The lead investigator turned to her, his gaze sharp enough to cut glass. "Ma'am, you've filled in a federally regulated wetland. Do you have a permit?" The silence that followed was deafening, capable of swallowing the entire neighborhood. Karen stammered, waving her clipboard like a flimsy shield. "The HOA board approved it," she squeaked, her voice trembling. The investigator didn't even blink. "The HOA does not have the authority to override federal law." The color drained from her face, as if someone had flipped a switch. I leaned against my porch railing, arms crossed, watching the queen of the cul-de-sac finally realize her crown was a cheap fake. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the balance of power shift. Not subtly, but like a tidal wave. What Karen had envisioned as her victory lap was about to become the most catastrophic mistake of her life. She had always treated the HOA like her personal kingdom, her fiefdom to rule. But as the EPA investigators left my property with grim faces, I could sense her confidence wavering. She tried to dismiss it to the neighbors, insisting it was just a formality, nothing to worry about. Yet her frantic pacing, her clipped tone, and the constant flipping through her battered clipboard betrayed her. She was scrambling, and when Karen scrambled, she made mistakes. This was excellent news for me, as I intended to document her downfall in glorious. The next morning, as I sipped coffee on my porch, Karen stormed across the cul-de-sac, her heels stabbing the pavement, as if to bruise the very earth. She didn't bother knocking. She planted herself at the bottom of my steps, arms crossed, and declared, "You're sabotaging community progress." I nearly choked on my coffee. "Progress?" I scoffed. "Last I checked, progress didn't involve excavators and dump trucks turning a vibrant ecosystem into a landfill." She tried to argue the HOA's right to beautify common areas, but when I reminded her the wetland was legally my deeded property, not the HOA's, her jaw clenched. She despised being reminded of technicalities she couldn't simply bulldoze. That's when her tactics shift. Karen leaned closer, lowering her voice to a venomous hiss. "You need to drop this before you embarrass yourself." It was almost comical. This woman had literally ordered trucks onto my land, yet she still thought she could gaslight me into believing I would look foolish. I took another sip of coffee, letting her words hang in the air. Calmly I replied, "Embarrassment is cheap, Karen. Fines are expensive. I'll let you do the math." Then I turned and went back inside, feeling her furious glare boring into my back, but refusing her the satisfaction of a second glance. What Karen couldn't fathom was that the EPA had already requested copies of the HOA's meeting minutes, permits, and contract. They weren't just after her, they were preparing to probe the entire HOA board. That night I overheard hushed, angry arguments spilling from the clubhouse. Karen's loyal allies on the board were far from thrilled at the prospect of federal scrutiny. One man's voice rose above the rest, sharp with indignation. "You said it was just landscaping." That single phrase told me everything. Karen hadn't told the board she was filling a protected wetland. She'd spun it as mere dirt work. Now her flimsy cover story was unraveling, and I hadn't even lifted a finger. By week's end, a certified letter arrived at my door. It was from the EPA confirming a formal investigation into the unlawful filling of waters of the United States. The language was dry, but the numbers were anything but maximum penalties of $50,000 per day of violation, restoration costs, potential criminal liability. My wife Sarah read it over my shoulder and whistled low. "She's in over her head," she murmured. I grinned. She's about to learn wetlands run deeper than her ego. The next day Karen called an emergency HOA meeting. She plastered flyers everywhere, painting herself as a victim of government overreach, and me as the instigator, weaponizing bureaucracy against our neighbor. That evening, I walked to the clubhouse, just to witness her desperation. The room was packed, residents crammed into folding chairs, the air thick with tension, and the faint scent of cheap perfume. Karen stood at the front like a revival preacher, proclaiming she was protecting property values and fighting for freedom against red tape. She pointed at me in the back row, sneering, and some people would rather side with outsiders than with their community. The crowd murmured, a mix of confusion and anger. I raised my hand. "May I?" Karen hesitated, unable to refuse without appearing tyrannical. So, I stepped forward, pulled out my phone, and played the video I'd taken of her directing those trucks. The audio was crystal clear, her voice barking, "Dump it all in." The HOA approved this. The room fell into a stunned silence. Then a voice from the front row broke it. "Did you actually get a federal permit for that?" Karen's face paled, her hands clenching the podium. She muttered, "It wasn't necessary." That was the final nail in her coffin. Board members exchanged uneasy glances. A few neighbors even rose and walked out. Karen had called the meeting to rally support, but instead she'd handed me a microphone and a spotlight. Her next move was even more reckless. 2 nights later, I caught her sneaking back onto my property with 2 unknown men. Flashlights in hand, they whispered about covering tracks. I hit record again from my upstairs window, zooming in as they tried to spread soil over the most obvious dump sites, as if sprinkling a little topsoil could erase the evidence of 20 truckloads of concrete. The sheer stupidity was breathtaking. When I flipped on my porch light and yelled, "Smile, you're on camera," Karen shrieked like a startled banshee caught mid-robbery. The men bolted, leaving their shovels behind, while Karen stumbled after them, her sun hat tumbling into the mud. I uploaded that footage directly to the investigator's email that very night. By now the EPA wasn't alone. Fish and wildlife biologists had arrived to assess the habitat damage. They took water samples, counted amphibian casualties, and measured sediment spread. One shook his head, muttering that full restoration could take years, perhaps decades. The irony was brutal. Karen had destroyed a wetland she called a useless swamp, and now she was potentially obligated, along with the HOA, to pay for its astronomical restoration. The neighbors quickly turned on her. People who once rolled their eyes at my HOA battles now whispered about Karen's arrogance in the grocery store. One woman confided she worried her dues would skyrocket to cover the fine. Another pondered suing Karen personally if her property taxes increased due to the mess. I simply smiled. You might want to start saving your receipts. But Karen wasn't finished. If anything, the pressure made her even more unhinged. A week later, she marched onto my lawn again, clutching a stack of papers she claimed were retroactive permits filed with the county. I skimmed them and nearly laughed aloud. They weren't permits at all, just letters of intent she'd printed online. No signatures, no approvals, nothing binding. I told her she might as well have written, "I own the moon," on a napkin. She exploded, jabbing her finger at me, screaming, "You're destroying this neighborhood." Just then, a police cruiser pulled up, lights flashed. 2 officers stepped out, calmly asking her why she was trespassing on my lawn at 9 o'clock at night. Watching her face crumble as she realized the police were not on her side was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. That incident was the final crack in her fragile facade. The next morning, the HOA board held a closed-door meeting. Without her, rumor had it they were discussing her immediate removal as president. For years Karen had terrorized the HOA like a petty dictator, fining people for overflowing garbage cans or improperly colored flowers. Now those same neighbors were sharpening their knives. I didn't even need to lobby them. The federal investigation was doing all the work. As the saga spiraled, Karen dropped all pretense of calm. The mask was gone, replaced by a frantic, cornered HOA president, who finally understood the noose was tightening. The EPA returned for their second inspection with clipboards, cameras and a drone buzzing overhead. capturing aerial shots of the ravaged wetland. Neighbors watched from their windows, whispering, as if witnessing the biggest scandal the neighborhood had ever seen, which frankly it was. Through it all, Karen tried to act like it was mere routine paperwork, but the cracks were undeniable. Her hands trembled when she spoke, and she snapped at board members who dared to inquire about rising dues. She was no longer queen, she was a sinking ship, and even her most loyal followers were scrambling for lifeboats. One of those loyalists, a meek man named Rick, who had always been her lapdog, pulled me aside at the grocery store one evening. He was jittery, like a teenager caught sneaking beer. He leaned in and whispered, "Look, Karen told us you wouldn't actually report that." She said, "You hated the swamp too." I nearly burst out laughing, but I maintained my composure. "Rick," I said, my voice steady, "the EPA has over 100 photos of dump trucks unloading concrete into federally protected land. Do you really think I could wave that away, even if I wanted to?" His eyes darted nervously. "She said you'd be the one in trouble, not her." That sealed it. Karen wasn't just panicking. She was rewriting history, trying to shift the blame onto me. This was desperation in its purest form. The next escalation arrived in the form of a lawsuit, or at least Karen's pitiful attempt at one. A thick envelope appeared in my mailbox, stuffed with papers her bargain bin lawyer had clearly drafted. It accused me of defamation of character, harassment, and malicious interference with HOA governance. I sat at my kitchen table, flipping through the nonsense, chuckling at the typos. Sarah leaned over my shoulder and murmured, "She actually filed." Sure enough, it bore the county clerk's stamp. It took my lawyer no time at all to dismantle it. He practically laughed through our entire phone call. "She's suing you for reporting a federal crime she committed on your property." He chuckled. "This isn't just weak, it's suicide. By the time I file the countersuit, she'll be begging for mercy." But Karen, being Karen, could not back down. She paraded around the neighborhood, telling anyone who would listen that she was taking me to court, that I'd regret messing with the H. A few nervous neighbors asked if it was true, if I could actually get in trouble. I calmly told them the truth. I had video, photos, witnesses, and federal investigators backing me up. The more plainly I spoke, the more Karen resembled a liar spinning fairy tales, and nothing rattles a self-proclaimed queen faster than losing her audience. Then came the twist I never saw coming. The EPA investigator called me late one evening, his voice tight. "Mr. Harrison, did you authorize additional work on your wetland this week?" I froze. "No," I said slowly. "Why?" He sighed. "Because someone's been back out there. We've got fresh fill, new soil spread, and it looks like an attempt to disguise what was done." I knew instantly. Karen had sent more people to tamper with the evidence. This wasn't just arrogance anymore, it was obstruction. And if there's one thing the government despises more than an environmental violation, it's someone trying to cover it up. Sure enough, my security camera footage showed her, Karen, in the dead of night, flashlight in hand, pointing as two men shoveled dirt over concrete piles. She looked like a general barking orders in a losing war. I sent that footage to the EPA before I even finished breakfast the next morning. When I received their reply, I almost felt a pang of pity for her. Almost. The investigator's email read, "This substantially increases her liability. Thank you for providing this evidence." Substantially. That single word told me the fines were about to skyrocket. By now, the HOA board had reached its breaking point. They called another emergency meeting. But this time, Karen wasn't invited to speak. I was. Walking into that room felt surreal. Just a month prior, these same people would have rolled their eyes at my milkweed plants or bat boxes near the wetland. Now they looked at me as if I were the only adult left in the neighborhood. Denise, the soft-spoken treasurer, cleared her throat and announced, "We need to discuss removal proceedings for the president." Karen sat in the back, red-faced and fuming, but utterly powerless. One by one, board members aired their grievances: unauthorized projects, reckless spending, and now a federal violation that could bankrupt the entire HOA. It was like watching her empire crumble brick by agonizing brick. Karen finally She leapt to her feet, screaming, "This is all his fault," jabbing a finger at me as if she wanted to gouge my eye out from across the room. "He's been sabotaging me for years." The room fell silent. I let her rant for a full minute, a litany of every petty grudge she'd ever held against me. My truck parked at an odd angle, my lawnmower too loud, my Halloween decorations too scary. It was an absurd display. When she finally paused for breath, I simply said, "Karen, the EPA doesn't fine people for Halloween decorations. They fine people for filling wetlands with concrete." The room erupted in murmurs, some neighbors even chuckling. She realized, too late, that she had just utterly destroyed her own credibility. The board voted unanimously to suspend her presidential powers until the investigation concluded. Karen stormed out, slamming the clubhouse door so hard the blinds rattled. The queen had been dethroned, at least temporarily, but I knew she wouldn't go quietly. Karen never did. Over the next few days, small acts of sabotage began to plague me. My mailbox mysteriously knocked off its post, a bag of garbage dumped in my driveway, my fence gate found unlatched in the middle of the night. I had no concrete proof it was Karen, but I didn't need it. The timing, the sheer pettiness, it all bore her distinct signature. Sarah worried it would escalate. "What if she gets really desperate?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. I tried to reassure her, but in truth, I was thinking the very same thing. People who build their lives on control don't handle losing it well, and Karen was losing everything. Then the real hammer fell. The EPA officially served Karen and the HOA with a notice of violation. The fine, a staggering $500,000, plus mandatory full restoration of the wetland, plus legal fees, plus potential criminal charges for obstruction, thanks to her midnight shoveling stunt. When the news broke, the neighborhood exploded. Some gasped, others laughed nervously. One man muttered, "There goes our retirement fund." The HOA board held an emergency session the next day to decide whether to dissolve the HOA entirely, to shield residents from liability. Karen wasn't invited that night. I saw her sitting alone in her driveway, head in her hand. For a fleeting moment, I almost felt pity, almost. But then I remembered her smug face that morning, when the trucks dumped their first load, and the pity evaporated like morning dew. She had brought this upon herself. She thought she could bulldoze her way through federal law, just as she'd bulldozed everyone else in this neighborhood. And now, for the first time, she was up against something immovable. The morning after the fine became official, the neighborhood felt as if it had been doused in gasoline, waiting for a match. Whispers filled driveways, phone calls ricocheted across the cul-de-sac, and the HOA board's inbox overflowed with furious email. Everyone demanded to know one thing: who was going to pay for this disaster? Technically, the HOA, as an entity, was liable, but nobody trusted Karen enough to believe she hadn't left some hidden loophole that would push the financial burden onto the community. And if anything could shatter suburban unity faster than a scandal, it was the specter of skyrocketing dues. I personally wasn't worried. My lawyer had already confirmed the HOA couldn't bill me for Karen's reckless project, as the land was deeded solely to me. But my neighbor, that was a different story. And that's when the cracks in Karen's crumbling empire truly began to widen. People who had once tolerated her petty rules were suddenly enraged, not because they cared about wetlands or environmental law, but because their wallets were at stake. Karen, of course, did not accept defeat gracefully. She appeared at my house mid-morning, red-faced and clutching a thick binder of papers. No knock, no call. She simply marched onto my porch as if she still ran the place. "You're going to fix this," she snapped, slamming the binder onto my patio table. The binder was nothing more than a stack of highlighted HOA bylaws, annotated like a desperate high schooler cramming for finals. She jabbed at a page with an acrylic nail. "Right, all property owners must share costs for community projects. That includes you." I leaned back in my chair, sipping my coffee, utterly unfazed. "Community project? Karen, you mean the illegal destruction of my wetland that the federal government just fined you for?" She scowled, but I pressed on. "Karen, you can't rebrand a felony as landscaping." She opened her mouth to argue, but just then, my phone buzzed with an email notification. I glanced down. It was from my lawyer. I grinned. "Would you like me to read this out loud?" She hesitated, but pride forced her to say yes. So, I read, "Dear Mr. Harrison, we've confirmed the HOA has no authority to pass restoration costs onto your property, given that the work was unauthorized and executed in violation of federal law. Rest assured, you are legally insulated from liability." I put my phone down and smiled. "Guess that means the swamp's your problem, not mine." Karen's face cycled through a kaleidoscope of emotions: shock, rage, panic. She stormed off my porch without another word, clutching her binder like a life raft. And I knew she was about to double down in some new disastrous way. She always did. That evening, The HOA board held yet another emergency meeting, and this one was standing room only. Neighbors packed the room, voices raised, demanding answers. Karen tried to retake the floor, insisting she had a plan, but Denise, the treasurer, cut her off. "You've done enough," she said flatly, her voice trembling not with fear but with controlled fury. "You've exposed all of us to financial ruin, and you lied about what you were doing. You told us it was landscaping." Karen snapped back. It was landscaping, but the words rang hollow. One of the board members, a mild-mannered man, who usually remained silent, finally spoke up. "Karen, you signed contracts with those truck companies in the HOA's name, without a vote. That's fraud." The room erupted in murmurs. Fraud. It was the first time anyone had uttered the word aloud, and it landed like a stone in a pond, rippling outward. Karen turned on him with a furious glare, but her usual intimidation tactics no longer worked. People had seen the drone footage, the EPA's letter, the $500,000 fine. They weren't afraid of her anymore. They were afraid of bankruptcy. That's when Karen unveiled her so-called plan. She announced she had filed an appeal to the EPA, claiming the wetland was not federally protected, but merely seasonal drainage. She waved a stack of documents she'd printed from some obscure website, none of which were remotely official. "Once this appeal goes through," she declared, her voice ringing with false triumph, "the fine will disappear, and we'll be safe." The room fell silent, not out of belief, but out of sheer shock that she thought anyone would buy it. Finally, someone in the back shouted, "That's not how it works," and the entire room erupted in laughter. Karen's face went scarlet. She slammed the papers down and screamed, "You're all ungrateful. I've kept this neighborhood beautiful for 10 years, and this is how you treat me." The board president, now the acting one since Karen's suspension, stood and declared, "Karen, we're voting to remove you from office, effective immediately." She screamed that it was illegal, that they couldn't do it, but the vote was unanimous. With that, Karen was officially dethroned. You'd think that would be the end, but Karen wasn't done yet. The next morning, a city news van parked at the end of the street. Somehow Karen had convinced a local reporter that she was the victim of environmental tyranny. I watched from my porch as she gave a melodramatic interview, gesturing toward my property, as though it were the villain in her tragic opera. "This man has weaponized the government against hard-working neighbors," she wailed into the camera, "all because he wanted to keep his swamp." I couldn't help myself. I shouted from across the lawn, "The swamp doesn't fine you $500,000, Karen. The EPA does." The reporter nearly cracked a smile, and the cameraman actually chuckled. Of course the story aired that night, but it didn't go as Karen hoped. The segment made her look utterly unhinged, especially when they cut to the EPA's official statement, calling her actions a serious violation of federal law. Within 24 hours, the clip went viral on local social media. Karen had wanted sympathy. Instead, she became a punchline. People created memes with her photo, captions like "It's just mud," and "Karen versus the swamp." Even teenagers in the neighborhood started mocking her whenever she drove by. If embarrassment were a currency, she was bankrupt. But humiliation wasn't the same as surrender. Late one night, I woke to the sound of frantic pounding at my door. When I opened it, Karen stood there, wild-eyed, clutching a crumpled letter. "They can't do this to me," she screamed, waving the letter like both a white flag and a weapon. It was the EPA's final note. Not only was the fine locked in, but she had 30 days to submit a restoration plan, approved by certified biologists. She was out of moves, and she knew it. She tried bargaining. "If you drop your complaint, they'll let it go. They told me," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. I shook my head. "Karen, even if I wanted to, it's not my call. You went up against the federal government. This isn't some HOA fine you can rig." She collapsed onto my porch swing, sobbing into her hands. For a brief second, a flicker of human pity almost stirred within me, but then I remembered the gutted wetland behind me, the dead frogs, the buried boardwalk. I remembered her smugness that first morning, calling it just mud, and the pity evaporated like morning dew. Karen's saga was far from over. The neighborhood held its breath. The EPA's restoration order wasn't just a fine anymore. It was a full-blown mandate. 30 days to submit a plan, 30 days to find $500,000, 30 days before criminal charges were on the table. Everyone knew Karen couldn't possibly comply, but knowing Karen,
She wouldn't go down quietly. She'd set the place on fire before admitting defeat. And sure enough, she tried. Her last desperate play came in the form of a community restoration project.
She plastered flyers on every mailbox, announcing a volunteer initiative to rehabilitate the wetland. In her twisted logic, if she could gather enough neighbors to shovel dirt and plant a few flowers, she could claim the HOA had restored the ecosystem and evade the fine. The flyer was full of buzzwords like green initiative and neighborhood pride. But it wasn't the words that caught my attention, it was the timing. She had scheduled her so-called project for the very same day the EPA team was returning to check compliance. The morning of the event, I sat on my porch, watching confused, hesitant neighbors trickle toward the wetland with gardening gloves and rakes. Karen stood at the front like a drill sergeant in yoga pants, barking orders. She told one group to scatter grass seed, another to drag mulch, and a third to hammer stakes into the mud. The result looked less like a restoration and more like a child's attempt to cover graffiti with finger paint. But Karen, sweating and red-faced, carried on as if leading a historic environmental movement. I considered staying out of it, but I couldn't. Not when I knew the EPA would be pulling up any minute. So I strolled down to the mess, camera rolling. "Morning, Karen," I said cheerfully. "What's this? The HOA's new landscaping club?" She glared at me, but her voice was syrupy sweet. "We're restoring the community wetland," she declared, loud enough for the volunteers to hear. "Unlike some people, we believe in taking responsibility." The neighbors exchanged uneasy glances, clearly wondering if planting tulips in cement chunks counted as restoration. And then came the moment I'd been waiting for. The unmarked government SUV rolled into the cul-de-sac, the same team of investigators stepping out with clipboards and grim faces. Karen froze, shovel in hand, then plastered on a saccharine smile and marched toward them. "Look," she exclaimed, gesturing wildly. "We're already restoring. You don't need to issue fines. We've handled it ourselves." The lead investigator raised an eyebrow, surveying the chaos. Mulch piles sliding into muddy water, wildflower seeds scattered like bird feed, and volunteers awkwardly stabbing shovels into concrete. He didn't even try to hide his laugh. "Ma'am," he said slowly, his voice laced with disdain. "Restoration of a federally protected wetland requires certified environmental engineers, hydrologists, and permits. This," he gestured broadly at the pathetic scene, "is tampering." The word hit like a grenade. Tampering meant obstruction. Obstruction meant criminal charges. Karen's smile cracked, then collapsed entirely. She stammered, but we were just," before the investigator cut her off. "Ma'am, step aside." He signaled to his team, who began meticulously documenting everything: photos, samples, notes. Neighbors dropped their shovels and backed away, horrified, realizing they'd accidentally walked into a federal crime scene. The exodus was immediate. By the time the investigators wrapped up, Karen stood alone, mud smeared on her leggings, staring at the wreckage of her last pathetic stand. That evening, the official notice arrived. In addition to the $500,000 fine, Karen was now facing a personal referral for obstruction of federal enforcement. It was the kind of letter that doesn't just ruin your week, it ruins your decade. And the board wasted no time making it worse. They held one final meeting, this time without her entirely. By unanimous vote, they dissolved the HOA. Effective immediately, the Homeowners Association that Karen had ruled with an iron fist for 10 years was gone, replaced with a simple neighborhood committee that had no power beyond organizing potlucks. The tyrant's kingdom had fallen, and in its place was nothing more than barbecue sign-up sheets. The next week was surreal. Karen's house became a ghost. Curtains drawn, blinds closed, no sign of her car. Rumor had it she was meeting with lawyers daily, desperately trying to salvage what little she could. Some said she was considering bankruptcy. Others claimed she was trying to sell the house before liens could hit. I didn't know, and I didn't care. My wetland was already scheduled for professional restoration under EPA supervision, funded entirely by the fines she had triggered. It would take years to undo the damage, but the process had begun. Bulldozers would haul out the concrete, hydrologists would regrade the soil, and biologists would replant native species. My swamp would rise again. One afternoon, As I stood by the edge of the wetland, watching a majestic heron land in the shallows, Karen appeared at the edge of my property. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her. No hat, no clipboard, no smug smile. Just a tired, broken woman with deep shadows under her eyes. "You won," she muttered, her voice barely a whisper. It wasn't an admission so much as a bitter, utterly defeated surrender. I didn't gloat. I didn't sneer. I simply said, "No, Karen, the wetland won. You just lost." She stared at me, her lips trembling as if she wanted to argue, then turned and walked away. That was the last real conversation we ever had. Within a month, a for sale sign appeared in her yard. The house sat on the market for weeks, its price dropping every few days. Buyers weren't eager to snap up property attached to a $500,000 federal scandal. Eventually, she moved out quietly, her car loaded with boxes, no goodbyes to anyone. A new family moved in a few months later, cheerful, polite, more interested in planting tomatoes than policing flower colors. The neighborhood collectively exhaled for the first time in a decade. The irony was profound. Karen had tried to fill my wetland because she thought it was ugly, a liability, a swamp dragging down her imagined property values. And in the end, that very swamp had taken her down instead. She underestimated it. She underestimated me, and most of all, she drastically underestimated the sheer, overwhelming weight of consequences. You can cheat your neighbors, bully your board, manipulate your little fiefdom, but you simply cannot outmaneuver federal law. As for me, I got my peaceful mornings back. I rebuilt the boardwalk, this time sturdier and longer, with a perfect bench at the end, where Sarah and I now sit with our coffee, watching the water slowly reclaim its territory. Frogs have begun returning, their croaks filling the evening air with their joyful symphony. The herons still come, patient and dignified, as if reminding me that time heals even the deepest wounds. And every time I see them, I think about Karen's voice, shrieking, "It's just mud!" I smile because to her, it was just mud. But to me and to the EPA, it was something far, far greater. It was proof that arrogance has its limits, and sometimes nature itself delivers the most profound justice. The neighborhood eventually forgot the details, but they never forgot the lesson. Nobody dared step foot on my wetland again. The new residents even pitched in to help plant native grasses during the official restoration project. And though the HOA was dead, the community thrived without it. Happier, freer, lighter. We learned we didn't need fines and clipboards to get along.